Welcome to the Diet by God's Design podcast. The goal of this podcast is to help you return to God's design for healthy living so you can balance your hormones and heal your body naturally. I'm glad you're here. Let's get to today's episode. In the last episode, we talked about chemicals in the home. Now let's get to the food you're buying at the grocery store. This topic really comes down to two main options. You can buy organic or non-organic. And side note, just because an item is labeled organic doesn't mean it truly is. So when I refer to organic food in this episode, I mean the foods that are truly organic, not just labeled organic. Now, the argument against non-organic foods is this. They can have many different pesticides, herbicides, and other chemicals on them. Though the USDA and FDA have mandated that the amounts of chemicals used must be below a toxic level, there are three problems with this though. One, if every food you eat has chemicals on it, at the end of the day, you've probably consumed enough chemicals to be way above the safe levels. Two, there has been little to no research on how a chemical used on one food interacts with a chemical used on a different food. It might be that these man-made chemicals are more dangerous when eaten together, but they don't really account for you're having a meal, not just one food item. Three, as I've said over and over, we don't understand the detriments of altering the natural, God-given design of things in nature. It often takes 50 plus years to see the research of one chemical if it's dangerous in the long term. Many of man-made chemicals used over 50 years have actually since been banned because of their long-term health detriments like cancer and birth defects. So it takes us, 25 to 50 years to see if a chemical is dangerous in the first place, which is crazy. So the best thing we can do to protect our health and our family's health is to buy foods from the grocery store that have lower amounts of chemicals, which brings us to organic foods. So organic foods have been certified by the USDA and are supposed to be grown or raised using more natural pesticides and herbicides. However, I'm afraid that most use the organic label, who do use this label, don't fully understand why. So they often end up replacing chemicals that have been deemed harmful with ones that haven't yet maybe been deemed harmful. Just because something is labeled plant-derived or plant-based doesn't mean it's safe. That just means that they took something from a plant and manipulated it in some kind of way. Now, though organic foods may replace one man-made chemical for another, they still typically have less chemicals totally on them as non-organic foods. So at least the people who are using the organic label are somewhat mindful of the chemicals they're using on the foods. Versus non-organic foods, it's fair game, you can do whatever. Now that you understand why organic foods tend to be safer than non-organic, let's talk about what to buy specifically at the grocery store. I recommend buying minimally processed organic food as financially able in place of non-organic food. So organic for the reasons we just talked about, and minimally processed because the less processed a food is, the closer it is to its natural design, the lower amounts of chemicals you'll be exposed to. Make sure you buy from companies you trust too, because a label does not mean the company is trustworthy. I said that above. An organic label slapped on. Most of the time they don't understand why they're using the label in the first place. A good place to start when switching to organic is to replace your staples, as able, of course. Grab your health journal with your list from last week's episode of chemicals under your kitchen sink and make a new list of foods in your fridge, freezer, and pantry right now that you cannot live without. What are the things that you're always on the grocery list when you go to the grocery store? Starting with one food item on your list, ask yourself, how can I make this item healthier? For my family, milk is a huge staple. I asked myself how I can make our 2% non-organic milk better, did some research, and switched to organic whole milk. Recently, I've come back to our milk and asked the same question. Can I make it any healthier, or is this it? Now we're drinking raw milk when we can get it and have money in the budget for it, and supplementing with organic whole milk as needed. I recommend doing this with your food staples, doing the research and replacing them. Sometimes even just replacing with another brand because another brand's more trustworthy. So do this before moving on to the foods you eat less often. I want to take a minute to encourage you here a bit. This process can be extremely overwhelming when you first start out because you have this long list of things you want to replace and you're just beginning with the first thing to replace. Just focus on what you can do and make one change at a time. One of my favorite quotes that I tell myself when I start getting overwhelmed is from Elizabeth Elliot. Quote, "Just do the next thing." End quote. I'm also reminded of what Jesus says in Matthew 6:34. Quote, "So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." End quote. I'm going to end on that positive note. So don't stress out about the changes you feel the need to make in your home. You've been living around chemicals your whole life and have survived. Your health may be suffering for it, but if you start limiting your exposure, then you're already doing better today than you were yesterday. God will sustain you. So in those times of overwhelm, remember, just do the next thing. You've got this. Stress can defeat you, but we just want to focus on improvement, and that's all we can do. And just be better tomorrow. I have some resources for you on the blog for this episode. One is Environmental Working Group's list of the produce with the most and least amounts of chemicals on them. Another is where you can get access to the list of foods I'm working on improving in our house. And lastly, there's a link for an article that I wrote giving you the sides for and against organic and non-organic foods. That way you can decide for yourself if organic foods is what it chalked up to be, or if you should just keep buying non-organic food. That's a personal decision and conviction for you and your family. So I want to give you that information if you would like to have that. That's all I have for this episode. Remember, when the overwhelm starts to hit, just focus on the next thing you can do. Next episode, we're going to talk about internal toxins and start working towards how to get rid of those internal toxins. So I hope to see you in the next episode. Before you go, can you help me out real quick and write a review or rate this podcast on the platform you're listening on? That way, this podcast can get out to more women who need to hear that they can heal their bodies naturally too. Thanks so much.